So we've gotten 6 episodes of The Rings of Power, and since the ending of episode 1, or maybe it was episode 2, everyone has been speculating on whether or not Sauron is actually among these characters in disguise. Most likely culprits for Sauron's identity have been the Meteor Man, Hal Brand, and Adar. Well, after episode 6, we know for a fact that Adar is not Sauron. He is an elf who was corrupted by Morgoth, and in fact, he claims to have killed Sauron. Personally, I think there is actually a third option, but I'll save that one for the end. First, we'll take a look at Meteor Man. I think a lot of people assumed that he was a member of the Astari or Wizards, or that he was less specifically one of the Maiar, which are the lower-ranked gods, broadly speaking. He could also very well be an original character for the show and not someone that you'll find in Tolkien's Legendarium. So what do we know about him? He came down to Earth either as a meteor or in a meteor, uninjured in the impact, and leaving a mark in the Earth that vaguely resembles the Eye of Sauron. And the fire of that made up that symbol was cool to the touch, possibly similar to the One Ring when Frodo pulled it out of the fire. This guy seems to have amnesia, can't really talk, doesn't even recognize food at first, but he has powers. He was able to drain the life from some fireflies, perhaps corresponding to some ability to absorb fire or light. He definitely has some level of influence over nature, and he also has super strength, being able to throw a warg and create a shockwave on the ground. Though this latter action does injure his arm, which says to me that his body isn't perfectly effective in utilizing his power. Which brings up another issue. While the Valar, or gods, are known to be more powerful than the Maiar, with Melkor and Manwë at the first and second spot respectively, under the one of course, and while each of the Valar and Maiar are associated with certain things, the power scaling and even the specific abilities of the Ainur are incredibly vague. There are, however, a few words that he's spoken which I can make out that give us clues to his identity. In episode 2, the Meteor Man said the words Mana Ure, which in Quenya, one of the Elvish languages, roughly translates to "what is light." He asked Nori this while pointing at a symbol that he had drawn on the ground, as well as stars that he had drawn on a rock. And we know how obsessed he is with stars. In episode 3, while healing his arm with ice, I can make out the words Kala, meaning light, and Envinyatar, meaning the renewer. Now, the only member of the Valar that I can associate with these words would be Varda, the queen of the Vala, whose job it was to situate the stars in heaven. The only male Maiar, assuming that Meteor Man is one of the Maiar, to have served under Varda is Aloran, also known as Gandalf. Could I see Amazon bringing Gandalf into this series? Yes. Does it break the lore? Also yes. Gandalf didn't show up until the Third Age after the War of the Last Alliance, and he arrived with 4 other wizards, though in some writings it said that the Blue Wizards may have arrived at a different time. So let's say that he isn't Gandalf, and also isn't one of the other known or unknown Maiar. What does he have going for him that points to him being Sauron? Well, again, the eye imagery, you could say. One other thing that is more of a theory that you could point out is that Adar claimed to have killed Sauron. Since we know that Sauron didn't die yet, maybe Amazon is changing the lore and saying that Adar only destroyed Sauron's physical body and the Meteor Man is his new form. Now in the books, Sauron's body was destroyed during the fall of Numenor, but when his spirit returned to Mordor, I'm fairly certain that he didn't have amnesia. Then again, he also doesn't have his spirit tied to the One Ring at this point. So in the end, I'm going to say that the chances of Meteor Man being Sauron are fairly low. Next we move on to Hal Brand, King of the Southlands, heir to one of the human families that pledged their service to Morgoth. That right there, Amazon's attempt to give Hal Brand a backstory and present him as a knockoff Aragorn makes me think that he's not Sauron. But we'll go through the clues anyways. First off, Hal Brand is an original character descended from an unnamed, made-up for this series family. So there isn't a strange language to translate or any gods to attribute to him. He met Galadriel at sea, seems to be very world-weary and have more common sense than Galadriel, and is also inexplicably skilled at blacksmithing. I say inexplicable because we don't have much background on his character. It's not like he was the blacksmith in some village when Galadriel met him, and yet he shows up to Numenor and says, "Hey, you might as well just give me a guild crest because I can make anything that you can make." He says that despite being a low man. The Numenorians were taught a lot by the elves, but also from Eonwë, the greatest warrior of the Maiar. Numenor is the greatest kingdom of men at this time, so you'd think that they'd be a little bit more skilled at smithcraft than a guy from the Southlands. So, is this a clue that Hal Brand is really Sauron, the Maya who originally served under Aule, the greatest creator in all of Arda, second only to Iluvatar. I mean, I'd say Sauron is in probably the top 3 craftsmen that the world has ever seen, after Aule, Melkor. Maybe you can make an argument for Feanor being the 3rd or 4th, given that he made the Silmarils, which no one else could do. Hal Brand was also very insistent on staying in Numenor, claiming that he wanted to start over. Could that simply be due to his eagerness to work his way up to becoming Pharazân's advisor, as Sauron does in the Silmarillion? Well, he does at one point in episode 4 say the words, "I wouldn't advise that," to Pharazôn. And I know a lot of people jumped on that as proof that he's Sauron, but the timeline doesn't make sense. Yes, I know that very little of Amazon's timeline of the Second Age makes sense, but Pharazôn hasn't even claimed power in Numenor yet. We also have to take into account the backstory that Amazon is failing to deliver for his character. He's supposedly king of the Southlands, he left behind a tragic past, and he bears a strong grudge against Adar despite the fact that Adar doesn't even recognize him. Is this implying that Hal Brand is the new form of Sauron after Adar destroyed his old body? Possibly. But another point that goes against it is something that I mentioned in my review of the second episode, is that there is no way that Sauron would choose to put up with Galadriel as long as he has. Yes, in the books he did go to the elves in his fair form and convince them to help him forge the Rings of Power. But for that, Hal Brand would be better served to go to Gil-galad or Celebrimbor, not the one elf still hell-bent on trying to find him. I do think Hal Brand has a stronger chance of being Sauron than the Meteor Man, but I also see how they are making him out to be the Aragorn of this series. Some interesting theories that I've also heard are that he will either become one of the kings that becomes the Nazgul, or that he was the king of the dead from Lord of the Rings: Return of the King. And although there's definitely some holes in those theories, I'd rather get behind those theories than him being Sauron. Now for the Dark Horse candidate, and this one's going to be pretty out there, but hear me out. So Gil-galad is one of the characters that we know very little about in the show. We know that he was trying really hard to convince Galadriel to give up her pursuit of Sauron, even sending her to the Undying Lands. Now, how would this be done if he was actually Sauron? Well, I would argue that Gil-galad doesn't have the authority to send someone to the Undying Lands either, so there's already a plot hole there. He claims to have sent Galadriel away to prevent the corruption that will supposedly kill the elves, but perhaps this story was just a ruse to trick Elrond into obtaining Mithril for him and having Celebrimbor build a forge powerful enough to create the Rings of Power. Perhaps the visible corruption of the tree is something that Sauron, posing as Gil-galad, caused himself. The way that he's casually deceived the elves, as well as his fervent insistence that Elrond betray his friend's trust to get a hold of Mithril, just doesn't seem right to me. This is the guy who's supposed to lead the last alliance of men and elves alongside Elendil. You could say he'll grow into that role, but he should already be at that point. He's the High King of the Elves after all. I could be wrong, but I'm not sure that Gil-galad has any speaking lines in any of the books, so I suppose there is some leeway in how Amazon interprets the character, but I always pictured him as being a noble king, and lying and trickery seem below him. It is definitely a reach to say that this means he is Sauron. In fact, this theory gives way too much credit to the writers, or maybe not. There are some big plot holes, like we'd have to assume that the real Gil-galad was taken prisoner at some point without the other elves noticing. I do also have an honorable mention here, and that is Galadriel. I think most Tolkien fans would agree that Galadriel has been written in a very uncharacteristic way. In episode 6, she even tells Adar that she'll keep him alive to watch her kill all of his offspring. Typically not something that a hero would say. Perhaps they'll reveal that Galadriel was Sauron all along. It wouldn't be worse than anything else that they've written so far, and I think a lot of fans would be relieved to see that this wasn't the real Galadriel. In all reality, it's possible that Sauron doesn't come into the picture until next season. I find it a little hard to believe that they introduced Adar and his not-so-sympathetic orc storyline just to get rid of them so quickly. I know the title and thumbnail were pretty clickbaity, but I hope this video inspires some interesting discussion in the comment section. If you guys enjoyed this video, I'd appreciate it if you hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. Also, hit that notification bell so you never miss out on a new video. I'll see you all next time. Bye.